Tonight, let us wander into a world where the tide of history turned on a gentler current. A world where the cry for liberty was answered not with musket fire, but with a long, slow conversation. Close your eyes, and let the familiar map of a nation soften at its edges, its borders drawn not by war, but by the patient hand of negotiation. We drift back to the late 18th century, to a world where the American Revolution never came to be. Imagine, if you will, the tension of 1775 not snapping like a frayed rope, but loosening, like a knot slowly worked open by careful fingers. Our point of divergence is not a grand battle, but a quiet room. Picture the heavy polished oak of a London study, the scent of beeswax and old paper hanging in the air. A fire crackles softly in the grate, its light dancing over the weary but resolved face of Lord Frederick North. The coercive acts, the so-called intolerable acts meant to punish Boston, lie on the desk before him. But on this day a letter has arrived, carried by a fast ship across the wintry Atlantic. It speaks not of defiance, but of profound weariness, from a loyalist, a merchant, a farmer, voices pleading for a different path. And on this day, the Prime Minister listens. He feels the weight of the empire, not as a crown to be clutched, but as a delicate, ancient vase that could be shattered by one wrong move. He sets the punitive legislation aside. Instead, he drafts a proposal for a grand Congress of the Colonies, to be held under the auspices of the Crown, not in defiance of it. The order is sent. The ships sail, and in the colonies, the first hot sparks of rebellion are met not with more tinder, but with an invitation to talk. The fuse, so nearly lit, is gently removed. The spring of 1775 arrives, not with the sound of marching feet on the Lexington Green, but with the sound of carriages rolling into Philadelphia, delegates arriving under a flag that still bears the Union Jack. And so, slowly, like a great ship changing its course by a single degree, the history of a continent begins to drift. The Congress convenes. The air in the Pennsylvania State House is thick, not with the heat of July, but with the cool mist of a prolonged autumn negotiation. You can hear the scratch of quills, the slow tap of a pipe against a brass spittoon, the murmur of voices, some raised in passion, others lowered in compromise. They speak of representation, of taxation, of the rights of Englishmen across the sea. Agreements are reached, piece by piece, clause by clause. The Crown concedes a permanent colonial assembly in America, a body to approve all taxation levied from London. The colonies affirm their allegiance, their place within the imperial family. It is not perfect, it is messy and legalistic and frustratingly slow, but it holds. The war that history remembers simply never comes. Let your mind drift forward, across the decades, as this new world unfolds. It is a world of evolution, not revolution. The political entity that emerges is not the United States of America, but the federated dominions of British North America. Picture its map. 13 original dominions, from New Hampshire to Georgia, but their western borders are not fixed at the Mississippi. They stretch, under charters from the Crown, into the vast interior, growing slowly like the roots of an old spreading tree. New cities rise, not as capitals of a new republic, but as provincial seats, with names like King's Landing in the Ohio Valley or Victoria on the shores of Lake Erie. Their architecture is a blend, red brick Georgian homes with neat white trim, but their public buildings are grand stone affairs with columns and domes, speaking of a shared British classical tradition, yet scaled for a new world. Let us step into this world, through the eyes of one who lives there. It is a crisp October morning in the year 1825. Elara Bennett is a cartographer's daughter, living in the bustling port dominion of Massachusetts Bay. She walks along the wharves of Boston, the air tasting of salt, dried cod, and the distant spice of tea from East India Company clippers. The sounds are a symphony of commerce, the cry of gulls, the creak of hemp ropes, the melodic shouts of dock workers whose accents are a unique blend of West Country English and something new, something born of the Atlantic crossing. Ilara carries a basket of apples from her family's orchard in Concord to trade for a length of Welsh wool. She pauses by a news post, its paper fluttering in the soft harbor wind. The headlines speak not of presidential elections, but of debates in the Continental Parliament in Philadelphia, and of the latest steam-powered dredge clearing silt from the Hudson River. A Royal Mail packet ship is preparing to depart for Liverpool, its schedule as regular as the tide. Ilara's life is woven into this tapestry of peaceful continuity. Her father's maps show a world still colored largely in imperial pink, but with vast, lightly sketched regions marked Crown territories under survey. Technology advances, but its path is different. The great railway networks, when they come, are built to a standard gauge decreed by the Imperial Board of Trade, linking Halifax to Savannah in a smooth, unbroken line. The telegraph wires that later hum with messages follow the rights-of-way of the Crown Postal Service. There is competition, yes, with the French in Louisiana, the Spanish in the Floridas, but it is the competition of trade routes and diplomatic influence, seldom of outright war on this continent. The energy that in another history went into forging a nation through conflict, here is channeled into internal improvements, into scientific societies sponsored by the Royal Society in London, into literary circles in Boston and Philadelphia that debate the works of Wordsworth and their own homegrown poets, who write of vast forests and wide rivers with a meter that still echoes with the rhythms of the Thames. The cultural fabric is a rich, complex plaid. One can attend a ball in Charleston, where the minuets are danced with perfect Georgian grace, and then step into a frontier tavern in the Alleghenies, where a fiddle plays a tune that is wholly, uniquely Appalachian, a blend of Scottish reels, African rhythms, and indigenous melodies. The Church of England is established in the southern dominions, but meeting houses of Congregationalists, Quakers, and Baptists dot the landscape of the North, all under a broad, if sometimes uneasy, umbrella of royal toleration. There is no manifest destiny as a violent, driving creed. Instead, there is a slower, more bureaucratic civilizing mission, a partnership between the Crown and colonial governments to settle lands through purchase and treaty, a process still deeply flawed and unfair, but lacking the frantic, explosive violence of a frontier pushed by a nation desperate to define itself. Follow the river of time further, into the 20th century. The great wars that scarred Europe still occur, but the federated dominions participate as integral parts of the British Empire, not as separate allies. Their soldiers fight under their own dominion flags, but these are ensigns with the Union Jack in the canton. The sense of sacrifice is profound, but the narrative is one of shared imperial burden and loyalty. In the quiet town of Williamsburg, Virginia, preserved not as a revolutionary capital, but as a living museum of 18th century colonial life, an old man named Henry sits on his porch in 1955. He sips tea sweetened with sugar from the Caribbean. He listens to the wireless, which crackles with a BBC broadcast relayed from a transmitter in Newfoundland. The news speaks of the independence of India, of the changing face of the empire. He feels a pang, not of nationalism, but of a quieter, more complicated sentiment, a sense of being part of something vast and ancient that is now, slowly, transforming into something new. His grandson attends university in Toronto, studying imperial law, and writes letters home about friends from Nigeria, from Malaya, from Hong Kong. The world is connected along old, deep-running imperial channels, for good and for ill. The night is deep now, and your breathing is slow. In this world, the skyline of Manhattan is a forest of stone and early steel, crowned not by the Statue of Liberty, but by the Gothic spires of a great imperial cathedral. The political discourse in the newspapers is a debate over tariff reform and dominion sovereignty within the Imperial Federation, not left versus right, in the way we might know it. the pace of life perhaps feels different. There is a deference to tradition, a patience born of knowing your place in a long, unbroken chain. Progress comes like the turning of seasons, expected, gradual, measured against the long reign of monarchs whose portraits hang in every post office and schoolhouse. So we leave this world as we found it, drifting on a quieter tide. A world where the idea of America is not a singular revolutionary flame, but a garden within a much older wall, a garden that grew in its own way, with its own unique and beautiful blooms, under a shared, distant sun. The energy of rebellion was transmuted into the energy of reform. The shout of defiance became the sustained murmur of debate in parliamentary halls. It is a world of gentle continuity, where history is a long, meandering river, rather than a series of crashing waterfalls. Thank you for wandering this alternate path with me tonight. As you drift toward sleep, picture the quiet, lamplit streets of a Boston that never knew a tea party, or the wide, peaceful farmlands of a Pennsylvania, where the only shots fired are to signal the start of a harvest fair. Imagine the soft, worn leather of law books in Philadelphia, pages turned by generations seeking change through words, not weapons. Let the thought of that slower, more patient world soothe your mind. Its story is one of ripples, not ruptures, of tides that turned with a whisper, not a roar. Let that calm water carry you now into deep and restful dreams. Thank you for dreaming with us tonight. Sleep well. Ilara's basket was a little heavier with the wool, a soft dove-gray bundle that smelled of lanolin and sea air from its long journey. She turned from the wharf, the cobbles smooth and damp beneath her shoes, and made her way up the gentle incline toward the Beacon Hill district. Here the sounds of the harbor softened, replaced by the rustle of fallen leaves, swept into neat piles by a shopkeeper's broom, and the distant chime of the King's Chapel clock marking the hour. The houses were tall and narrow, their brick facades clad in ivy that was just beginning to flame into autumn red. From an open upper window drifted the careful scales of a pianoforte lesson, each note precise and unhurried. Her father's workshop was on the ground floor of their home, its windows large to catch the northern light. Pushing the door open, Ilara was met by the familiar, comforting scent of ink, parchment, and the faint, clean tang of zinc from the etching plates. Silas Bennett looked up from his drafting table, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. A large vellum sheet was spread before him, held down at its corners by polished river stones. It showed the western reaches of the Ohio Territory, a tapestry of fine lines indicating rivers, and shaded areas marking the latest Crown Survey claims. "Ah, there you are, my dear," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Did you secure the wool for your mother?" "I did, father," from the Marianne. "It only made port this morning." She set her basket on a clear corner of a secondary table, careful not to disturb a stack of copperplate engravings waiting for hand coloring. Silas leaned back, stretching his shoulders. "Come, look at this. The latest dispatches from the surveyors have come in." He pointed a calloused finger to a blank space on the map, northwest of a sketched-in settlement labeled King's Landing. "They've confirmed the course of this tributary. It bends here, you see, not as we had extrapolated from the older French charts. It changes the drainage, the potential for mill sites." His words trailed off into a professional satisfaction. To him, the world was not a fixed thing, but a story slowly being transcribed, its truth revealed not by conquest, but by measurement and observation. Ilara leaned over the map, her shadow falling across the uncharted lands. She saw not emptiness, but a space awaiting definition. In this world, these vast interiors were not won in a war and thrown open in a rush, but were being gradually unveiled, like a portrait emerging from a blank canvas under an artist's patient hand. Land was granted to veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, not as a wild scramble, but in orderly parcels, with surveys done first, Treaties with the indigenous nations were a continuous, often contentious process conducted through the Crown's Indian Department, a flawed and paternalistic system, but one that operated, at least in theory, under a single, distant legal framework that sometimes, just sometimes, checked the worst excesses of local greed. "Will there be a new plate?" she asked, tracing the line of the river with her eyes. "Indeed. I shall start the sketch this evening. The Royal Geographical Society expects the updated folio by year's end." There was pride in his voice, but no haste. Accuracy could not be rushed. Later, after a supper of mutton stew and bread, Ilara sat by the parlor fire with her mother Margaret, who was winding the grey wool into a skein. The firelight played over the spines of books on the shelves, volumes of Blackstone's commentaries, the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, a well-worn Bible, and the latest serialized novel by Sir Walter Scott, sent by a cousin in Edinburgh. "Mrs. Winthrop tells me her son has taken a position with the Crown Postal Service," Margaret said, her hands moving in a steady, rhythmic motion. "He is to be stationed in Upper Canada. Something about the new steam packet service on the Great Lakes." "A steady occupation," Silas murmured from behind his own book, a treatise on hydrography. Ilara looked into the flames, imagining the young man she'd known since childhood, standing on the shores of that immense inland sea, overseeing the loading of mailbags onto a vessel that belched wood smoke into the clear northern air, connecting one part of the vast, pink-shaded empire to another. It seemed a world away from the wharves of Boston, and yet it was part of the same continuous whole. She thought of the Newspost headline she had seen that morning, a debate in the Continental Parliament over infrastructure bonds. It was about the dredging of a river, the building of a canal. The politics here were the politics of connection, of administration, of gradual improvement. The fiery rhetoric of a Patrick Henry existed only in history books, as a footnote of what might have been. A passionate speech that ultimately gave way to cooler heads in that long-ago Philadelphia hall. The great orators of this age were not tribunes of the people, but barristers and ministers who argued precedent and economic advantage in somber, wood-paneled chambers. The days passed, each one a stitch in the steady embroidery of this alternate life. On Sunday, the family attended service at the Old North Meeting House. The sermon was not a call to any earthly rebellion, but a meditation on duty, community, and the patient acceptance of divine order. The hymns were sung to familiar tunes, the voices of the congregation rising in harmony that was, if not perfectly unified, at least cordial. Afterward they took a walk on the common, where the leaves were a blaze of gold and crimson. Children rolled hoops, and a small military band in red coats played a selection of Handel. The sound of the music, crisp and formal on the cool air, was not a provocation, but a simple piece of the civic backdrop, like the clock tower chime. As autumn deepened, Ilara accompanied her father on a journey to Concord to visit a family orchard and to deliver a finished map to a local landowner. They traveled not by any great national road, but by a well-maintained turnpike, its tolls set by the Dominion legislature. The countryside unfolded in a patchwork of fields and woodlots, stone walls marking boundaries that had been settled for generations. They passed a regiment of Royal Engineers, their uniforms dusty, surveying for a proposed branch line of the Boston to Albany Railway. The officer in charge exchanged a polite salute with Silas, recognizing a fellow servant of the Empire's meticulous order. In Concord, the past felt present, but it was a different past. The Old Manse was not a revolutionary headquarters, but simply the comfortable home of a minister. The bridge over the Concord River was a site of picnics, not a mustering point for militia. The tension that once crackled in this air had long ago dissipated, leaving behind a profound, almost sleepy peace. The apples in the Bennett orchard were harvested, pressed into cider and stored in cool, dark cellars. The cycle of the year turned on its axis, governed by sun and soil, not by the urgent drums of war. One evening, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, wrapped in a shawl against the chill, Ilara looked at the stars. They were the same stars that shone over Virginia, over Kentucky, over the vast unmapped plains beyond. In her world they shone down on an entity that was not a young nation, defiant and alone, but on a continent-sized component of something older and more sprawling. The thought did not fill her with patriotic fervor, nor with a sense of stifled destiny. Instead, it brought a feeling of being small but securely placed, a single leaf on a deeply rooted ancient tree. Her dreams that night were not of liberty or rebellion, but of quiet cartography, of drawing clean, accurate lines across blank spaces, of filling in the world, slowly and carefully, one peaceful survey at a time. Back in Boston, as the first frost silvered the window panes, news came of a different sort. A packet had arrived with word from the Imperial Board of Science in London. A fellowship had been granted to a Society of Natural Philosophers in Philadelphia for the development of a refined calculating engine based on the designs of Mr. Babbage. The announcement was printed in the Massachusetts Bay Gazette, next to notices of ship arrivals and the quarterly meeting of the Loyal Society of Tradesmen. Progress here was often a collaborative, transatlantic affair, a sharing of knowledge along the well-worn routes of empire. Winter closed in, a season of introspection and inward focus. The harbor iced over at the edges, and the sounds of the city were muffled by snow. In the warm glow of the workshop, Silas and Alara worked on the new map plate, their heads bent together under the pool of light from an oil lamp. The scratch of the etching needle on copper was a tiny, precise sound in the quiet room. They were recording their world, not creating it. There was a deep humility in the act. And as the needle traced the newly confirmed bend of the river in the Ohio Territory, a river that no Minuteman would ever die beside, Alara felt the profound quiet of this history. It was a history of ledgers and treaties, of surveyors' chains and parliamentary sessions, of steam engines imported from Cornwall and novels exported to Sydney. It was a world where the grand, disruptive, world-altering event had been avoided, replaced by the cumulative weight of countless small, deliberate actions. It was, she thought, not a story of a people forged in fire, but of a people woven into a tapestry that was sometimes frayed, often uneven, and whose pattern could be stifling to some. But it was whole, it was continuous. And in the silent lamplit room, with the snow falling soft and thick outside, that continuity felt less like a chain and more like a deep, steady heartbeat, pulsing slowly across oceans and continents, connecting her small, focused world to something impossibly vast and enduringly calm.